All right, welcome everybody. Those of you that are joining us live, we appreciate you taking the time where we're talking about crisis proofing your organization. So I'm ready. I have coffee, I have water, and and I've got some great guests. So we have JT, our partner here at Azimuth, and we've got Jeremy Clark, the one of the co-founders of IXN Solutions. And today we're going to be talking about the importance of establishing a counterintelligence program for your organization. Yeah, spy stuff. Okay, so if you've seen it in the movies, it really happens, and it can also happen to your organization. So, Jeremy, welcome, and tell us a little bit about yourself and IXN.
Hey, thanks, Larry and JT. Appreciate the opportunity this morning to talk about something that I'm rather passionate about. So, I'm a retired CW4 Army warrant officer that spent a career in counterintelligence, specifically the operational side of the house, mostly CONUS based, some OCONUS, some deployed environments, just because that was the pace during which time I served. After 26 years, I decided to retire. I jumped on board a small team out of the Pentagon focused on identifying vendor solutions to make the Army better, faster, and stronger, mostly tied to intelligence disciplines. The Army was modernizing, and one thing that was left behind was the actual intelligence disciplines. As I was on that team and loved the job, I identified that there was a significant gap in counterintelligence. A lot of different things were happening in the world, and over a bar napkin one evening while drinking bourbon with my co-founder Scott Sparks, we came up with the idea of IXN. We love counterintelligence so much it's actually in our name: identify, exploit, neutralize solutions. So we've been on this endeavor for about 2 years right now. We're helping corporate and government entities do kind of full spectrum counterintelligence support, whether it's a theory to practice or theory to training practice. Our services pillar, which I expect we'll talk quite a bit about, and we also have a technology out there, 351X, few retired warrant officers out there. I'm sure you'll appreciate the name. Really, that focuses on NISPOM C3 policy to process type of fix with a counterintelligence mindset behind it. We're definitely looking forward to our conversation, gentlemen.
Awesome, thanks. And we share the same background. I spent 32 years in the federal government as a counterintelligence officer, and loved every minute of it. And then as I left the federal government, I noticed the need for that in corporate America, and a lot of times it's just not focused on, and because it's not part of the business context in most business leaders' minds. So, can you talk a little bit about how you guys kind of transform what we did for the government into a corporate culture?
Yeah, sure. Great question, Larry. Thank you. So, first, if you think about counterintelligence, oftentimes it's really thought of with the Department of Defense. They're very good at protecting their equity, mostly their soldiers, all the way up through their secrets. It's a very dedicated force out there to kind of track those breadcrumbs into identifying those leaks, whether it's an intentional leak or an unwitting leak, which I can get into here in a little bit. But if you take those counterintelligence principles and overlay them to the corporate industry, the same principles can be applied to protect equity. Look where our fight was for about 22 years, and that was in the Middle East. And when we're out there and we're engaging the adversary in the Central Command area, we forgot that the homeland needed to be protected. So as we were focused west or east, depending where you are, we left the doors wide open for adversaries to start infiltrating. The government was good about fending those threats off in the human domain. So the adversary, as they do, adapted. They looked for those weak points where the secrets were still there, maybe before they actually became classified, or the production of the kind of new widget that is being used or will be used by forces out there. And they recognize the defense industry base or corporate world, whether it's dual use technology or, again, those devices that are going to be in the hands of the soldiers. That was a good place to target. The defense industry base in corporate America, in my assessment, was not well positioned to protect what mattered the most: their people, their technology, their information, and that company reputation. So again, by applying what we learned through careers and decades of doing counterintelligence, from identifying unknowns all the way up to getting them in through prosecution, to proactive programs in identifying threats and countering those threats before they actually become an incident, you can apply those principles to the corporate world to help them protect what matters the most. And in the end, what matters the most is that soldier on the ground, to be honest. But everybody kind of ties into how do we support those individuals out there.
Yeah, so I know a term we brought up in our conversations on crisis proofing our organization, and Jeremy and I talked about this a lot, is the concept of getting left of bang. And,
Yeah.
military background, we all understand what that bang is, right? It's like major event, and you want to be in front of it so that you can prepare for, you're not necessarily stopping the event, but being able to lessen the impact of it. And I know, man, I used to get some dirty looks when I would say this to all my CI investigators out there. Was when they would celebrate the outcome of a CI investigation, of an espionage investigation. I'd always say, well, every successful counterintelligence investigation is a result of a failed counterintelligence. So we didn't do our job left of bang, so we had to do our job to the right of bang. So when we put this into a corporate scenario, what are some of the things that are left vulnerable that we need to be looking at?
I share that same kind of attitude with you, Larry, when it comes into identifying real spies and getting them arrested. I love the investigations. I'm glad there are people doing it, but you're absolutely right. Something has already been compromised. There was something that was missed that led to kind of somebody doing something nefarious. I think about the federal government. There's a whole bunch of cases across the board from Aldrich James, Robert Hansen, all the way up through these current ones that are happening. But the corporate side has just as many. Whether you're looking at Greg Chung from Rockwell and Boeing, or Harold Martin from BAH, Edward Snowden, kind of really more that kind of DoD, rogue engineers out of Google to Uber, Leon Ding out of Google. There's a whole bunch in the corporate side. So getting to the left to boom, I think, is critical, and it ties into a proactive counterintelligence program. And for you corporate entities out there, it can be rather arduous to get to understand what that means. Let me tell you, real counterintelligence work is not what you see in spy movies, to be honest. It's not about going out there and engaging the adversary every day. However, we do that every day. Counterintelligence work to me is really about grit. It's about determination, passion, persistence, and being engaged with the entity out there. Whether you're supporting the government, you need to engage the force, or a corporate entity, you need to engage your enterprise. Understand what's happening. So, number one, sometimes it may seem like boring work, but let me tell you, the impact to protected can be tenfold. Also, I'll end with this before handing it back over to you, Larry. There's a saying in counterintelligence: "I'd rather be lucky than good." I find that comical because I like to create my own luck, and you do that again through that grit and determination out there and being engaged with the force. But if you're a counterintelligence professional, insider threat program director within a corporate entity, it's about being present.
No, that's awesome, and I agree 100%. I know one of the frustrations I had in my career a lot of times when we were working with larger organizations, and they would bring CI in. It's when they brought CI in after the planning was done and they're getting ready to launch the mission, and all of a sudden, oh, by the way, we need to have the counterintelligence in here to protect us. It's like, well, you need to be part of the planning process and the strategy process. So from a business standpoint, that's a seat at the table constantly. I want to ask JT to jump in here. So, JT, as a former commander in the Marine Corps, I know you weren't Intel, but Intel was there to support you. How often did you bring the CI guys in to help support your mission?
Yeah, I would say mostly when we were forward deployed. As we're doing workups, we wanted to train with them, make sure that we understood their capabilities and how we could best support them supporting us. It was kind of help me help you kind of thing. And so it was just another one of those many elements that go into a successful team effort when you're trying to accomplish a mission and adapt to a challenging environment and a thinking adversary. So yeah, I would say it's absolutely important. And one of the things that Jeremy said about sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. There's another saying that luck is when preparation meets opportunity. And so I think going into the preparation side of things, and this can link a little bit back to what we've talked about in terms of crisis proofing your organization. So much of what we talk about is how do we get as you said, left of bang. And so there are always limited resources in terms of time and money and just manpower, and hours that people have. So how do you think big picture? How do you allocate those, those resources you have to cover all the many bases, whether you're trying to develop a culture, whether you're trying to grow capacity technically, or whether you're trying to grow leadership, or whether you're investing in, information protection, and counterintelligence and those sorts of things. So part of that is risk assessment, and strategic planning. So I think those are all related, and they're significant considerations. So I'm glad that we've got Jeremy on to bring some of that perspective. And I was going to highlight, although I'm not a counter intel guy, I'm glad to see that we have a couple of counter intel folks. I considered myself a low intel guy when I was on active duty, and so I feel very comfortable with you guys.
Awesome. One of the things, businesses always look, and as they should, I mean, when I'm a business owner, you're a business owner, Jeremy, we're looking for opportunities, right? And I know when I come into an organization, I help teams, one of the things we'll do is do a SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And very seldom, if ever, in the threat category, does anybody say internal threat or external adversary threat. And in prep for this, I did a lot of research, just kind of saying, hey, what's going on today in corporate America? Let's say China has always been a threat, not just to federal government, but also to corporate, because why would I create something if I can just steal it? And it's prevalent. And a lot of people feel they're immune from this. Are you running into that with your corporate clients? And if so, what do you tell them when they're like, oh, China's after the big stuff, they're not after this?
It's way cheaper to steal information than it is to do the R&D piece together, and China has figured that out. So I think you're onto something, Larry. The cybersecurity tools, they're getting better and better. It's harder for the adversary to get on a networks and rip information off, which ultimately I assess what they're going to go back to is that second oldest profession. We're going to steal it, and we're going to put more money and resources to it. Cybersecurity tools get better. They're going to transition and adapt to the battle space. I think about going into the C-suite individuals, and they're like, well, I don't really want to spend money to do a counterintelligence program. But if you go in and use their words, what matters the most to kind of the C-suite individuals? It's the bottom line. It's the livelihood of their employees. It's protecting what they built a company around, whether it's technology, a process, a trade secret, proprietary information, or whatever it is. If and when that gets compromised, because the adversary, not just a foreign adversary, but a competitor, wants to gain that operational advantage, they're going to try to steal that information. Again, it's easier to steal than it would be to try to R&D. When I look at the landscape we're in right now, do you know that 94% of breaches involve a human factor? 94%. Somebody, a human, is behind the scenes trying to rip a company off or rip an entity off. It's damaging to me. So if you go in with hard statistics to say C-suite individual, at 94%, that's significant. Can you imagine what would happen if 94%, say 50% of your information, a piece of your proprietary information gets stolen? The impact that's going to have on your company and your bottom line. How are you going to explain that to the board? Investigations are happening quite often, so I think it's easy to talk about relevant cases right now. Again, I listed a whole bunch before. I won't go back into them. But using those as examples, these were insider threats, employees that were hired by a company to do a specific job, and they're selling you out. They're unhappy. If you pull the thread on those individuals, though, they left breadcrumbs. As a counterintelligence professional, and if a company doesn't want to purchase or hire a full-time employee, there's other options out there. Well, maybe I'll get into that later, Larry. But as a counterintelligence professional, you have to be comfortable with imposing your will. When an incident has already happened, something has been compromised, and oftentimes that the C-suite individuals are going to try to put back in a box. Damage control. What we're preaching is don't let it get to that point. Protect your people, your technology, your process, your information, and your reputation. If you employ good counterintelligence principles, you can identify threats before they happen. You can identify those most vulnerable or susceptible to being foreign threats or adversarial threats, competitor threats, before they actually do something. And that's what we're about. We want to identify those individuals, those ones that haven't crossed the line, but maybe leading up to breadcrumbs of being vulnerable. When you go to conferences, when you travel overseas, when you have a foreign contact, again, being a competitor or actually being a foreign individual. Those are the pieces that you can kind of put together to really frame an individual's susceptibility to doing something nefarious. All we want to do, though, is get in front of that individual before they execute something. And it goes back into, I think, the first stage of this whole thing, going in with the C-suite individuals to sell a program. Let me help you identify what matters the most in a requirement. In the government, I ran offensive operations for the majority of my career. And the number one thing was you had to identify a requirement. And a requirement in the corporate side is what's that intellectual property, what's that trade secret, the thing that makes you special. Let's identify that. If a C-suite individual says everything, well, we try to help them navigate into understanding that's impossible. You
Right.
probably have one or two things you truly want to protect. Let's identify that. Here's why we're going to identify it. If that's what keeps your business afloat and makes you different, you want to protect that golden nugget.
No, and oh my God, I can't tell you how many times when I've asked that question, well, what's most important to you? Well, everything. Well, what could cause the most damage if lost, right? And there's tons of case studies out there. One I read the other day on Google. Their Waymo driverless car technology.
That's right.
And literally an insider, an employee, gathered up all this data and walked across the street to Uber as they were getting ready to launch theirs and took it with him. It was a $214 million cost to Google. And now, yeah, Google's got enough money that was probably a drop in the bucket. But think about the smaller, startups, mid-sized companies. What would the devastation be if they lost their intellectual property, if they lost the trust of their stakeholders and their customers? You might not recover from it. So we hear this all the time, both I know you do and Jeremy and I do when we talk to folks. It's like, well, I want to develop my leaders, but that's a cost I don't want to pay for right now. Like, it's not a cost, right? It's truly an investment because of not only what you're saving in the long run, but what you're protecting. So I just wonder, like some company like Google, had they spent the money for a counterintelligence program internally, what would have been the cost difference of, losing 200? I know it wouldn't have cost them $214 million for one of your guys to come in and protect their infrastructure.
True statement.
But so let's talk about that a little bit. What is the cost of not having a counterintelligence program outside of just the money?
Yeah, that would be a great question to ask Google, because not only is the rogue engineers from Google to Uber, who this engineer stole 14,000 documents on the self-driving car. And what he did, he set up his own company and ultimately got bought out by Uber. If you look back, even before this, Leon Ding, another Google engineer, he worked on the generative AI code of Google. That's the heart and soul. He did something similar as this rogue engineer that set up his own company with Uber. He ripped the code off. There are a whole bunch of breadcrumbs. He opened his own business in China. And when he came back to the US, ultimately, he was arrested. But there were breadcrumbs out there. I think that there's a lot of companies out there that are facing this right now. So I think the cost of investment is minuscule comparatively to the damage that it can cost. Google, they probably lost their generative AI code because it ultimately is in the hands of the Chinese right now. Look at their self-driving car apparatus, right? It's over with Uber right now, all these sensitive documents. Now, I would challenge any CEO. Do you want that to happen to your organization? Those special secrets to get out? What makes you different? It sets you apart. Now your competitor has an operational advantage, not just a foreign adversary, but now you're going to compete with Uber and your self-driving car, Google. So I think the cost is minuscule comparatively to the amount of equity protection you can have. I do have numbers, but Larry and JT, I apologize. Those numbers are buried somewhere on my desktop. So I'll send those over to you when I get them, because we use it to brief the C-suite individuals often.
Sure. JT, you got anything to ask Jeremy real quick? I don't want to leave you by your pool there.
I'm spending a good amount of my time as a student right now, and I know that a lot of research is done in an academic environment. Are you seeing any interest in that arena in terms of protecting information, especially from a larger country standpoint? Not just the institution.
Yeah, JT, that's a great question. I'm fearful what's happening in the corporate and the defense industry base, and that is probably escalated 10 times about what's happening in the academic facilities right now. If you look at the mentality or the mindset of academia, the academic community, it's a sharing community. We have grants out there that we sponsor and host foreign individuals coming in to work on these technologies that potentially could be dual used. Unfortunately, this is my own assessment. So hell be damned, you can curse me for it. Really comes back into who do we have working on this research? What vetting have we done on these individuals? Who are they reporting back to? Pick a foreign country, and are they? I don't think there's much vetting going on, and I hope the government changes that. Because again, I think it's problematic. Again, the adversary is very good at adapting. The government has kind of shut the doors, and they've kind of redirected to the corporate, to the defense industry base, and most certainly in the academic community. And it's a hard problem set. I think that's going to be fixed. There's so many policies out there that kind of prevent counterintelligence or insider threat protection individuals from getting there to help the academic community, why it's important to report these various things: foreign travel, foreign contact, suspicious activity reports, the whole gamut of counterintelligence activities. So to change that culture, boy, I want to help fix that problem because it is a significant problem. The adversary knows it's a weakness for us. We need to shore it up.
I know in my prior life, when I was still, working for the government, it was an issue back then, academia, because we had a lot of one of the soft underbellies for it were like the ROTC programs, because you had active duty members working in these programs, so they were bridging back and forth from academia to their work computer, and there was no protection, no VPNs, and so that was an entry point. I read something this morning where they're trying to pay, and I don't have all the details on it, but they're changing the way academia and the federal government connect together. Because here's one of the things I always ask: like, what's the difference between a classified project that's turned over to the government while it's in development? Okay, because when you finish development, it's not classified yet. It's not until it's turned over. So everything you need is right there, ready for the picking in academia, because they don't lock it down, because academia is a shared environment, as it should be for development, because we need the brain power. But like you said, Jeremy, how do we vet the right people? Because it is truly a vulnerable place and a soft spot for the threat to get to that. But going back to the corporate side, we mentioned earlier before we jumped on about today's market, right? The job market is suffering. Cultures and organizations, people are losing people. People are getting laid off and fired, and how does that create a threat, or can it create a threat?
Yeah, I do believe it can create a threat. So if you think about a person that's been working at a company, say for 5, 10, 15 years, and all of a sudden they get a notice, we need to downsize, that affects their livelihood. That could be an indicator. And people often, not often, sometimes, because I like to say espionage doesn't happen very often. We're good, we'll catch you. So you bad guys out there doing bad things. But they're getting put into a predicament where their livelihood's affected. I mean, we were briefly talking, Larry, like you were said before the podcast kicked off. And really that timing is critical. I think the companies out there owe it to the employee base to help give them another skill set that they can kind of leverage to get another follow-on job. Maybe continue to pay them with a severance package until they get back up on their feet, but you are opening yourself up to potentially something being harmful. And if it's time to let an employee go, it's time to let an employee go. You have to look and maintain their kind of cybersecurity logs, watch the traffic, what they're doing, sit down with the individual, make sure they're in a good mental state. If they're not, help the individual out, especially if they've been with the company and given up, and try to help build their livelihood with their particular company they're a part of. I do think that, as the government looks to kind of right size the footprint as well, provides the adversary an opportunity to go ahead and dangle things out in front of them, whether it's through a massive LinkedIn campaign like the Chinese often employ, or just an aggressive approach by other foreign entities out there, knowing that you're about to lose a job. We can come help you. We want to know what's in your head.
No, absolutely. And I noticed that there's a trend right now where foreign adversaries are all over LinkedIn and, offering jobs and, high paying jobs. And they realize once they're sucked in, it's like, oh, wow, this is something else. And so one other thing I wanted to touch on is ransomware. I don't know how often you guys deal with it, but it is a big thing. It's hard to prevent, but a lot easier to protect from. And a lot of people are like, well, I'm not big enough. Nobody's interested in what I've got. But I had a case years ago where it was a little mom and pop company, small, mid-sized company, and an adversary had been in their network for 8 years by the time we got there. And the only reason we got there is because it was launch point into a federal system. So, we came in to see what was going on. But what can companies do? Is that part of your CI program, is to help them prepare and protect from ransomware?
That is, I think that goes back to good training, but I do think the soft underbelly is those small and medium-sized companies. They might not have the resources for a dedicated full-time employee to look at protecting their equity. So for a smaller, medium-sized company out there, it starts with that requirement development. We just talked about that. The next piece on top of that to overlay it is, now that we have identified what matters the most, let's put policy in place. Anybody that touches this particular piece of widget or information, you should have a foreign travel policy. And that foreign travel is either overseas or maybe to a conference, a symposium, a seminar. You need to look at having suspicious activities reported, not ratting your kind of fellow employee or peer out, but hey, this is just weird. And oftentimes indicators can be picked up by fellow employees. Fellow employees need to understand the importance of that. And that ties into that next phase after you've identified a requirement, built the policy, is training. A lot comes back to training. And it has to be tailored training. Every company is a little bit different. And what I would recommend out there, build a specific training package tailored to that organization. So for their small mom and pop companies, how is the adversary targeting through ransomware, phishing emails, direct approaches, indirect approaches, and cater it to that particular employee audience. So this way you have a very active and engaged audience that actually explains the real threat to their company. Here's how the adversary would look at attacking you. Help train them on identifying what indicators look like, undue affluence, for example, with fellow employees. If they make as much as you do and you don't make very much, and they roll up with a new Jaguar, that could be an indicator. If they live in a multi-million-dollar house, and again, they are making similar salaries and you can't afford that, maybe they made some good life decisions, or maybe they are doing something nefarious. Report it. Do not self-adjudicate. Let somebody else take a look at it, because that could be the breadcrumb that identifies an individual who's harming the company. So beyond training is that reporting piece. You have to have an anonymous or a system to report those type of threats to the appropriate individuals so they can make those informed risk decisions or pass those decision matrix up to C-suite individuals so they can make the informed decisions.
Awesome. I tell you, we could probably sit here and talk for hours on that. I'd love to talk to you. Maybe we do a workshop on this and give us more time, because there's a lot to unpack. And the purpose of this, half hour is really to just bring awareness to organizations. If you want a crisis proof, you've got to consider a robust counterintelligence program. JT, you have anything to ask Jeremy before we start to close out?
No, I was just going to highlight one thing. I suspect you would agree with me that a little bit is way more than nothing.
Right.
Taking that first step, and that's the great advantage of having a subject matter expert and a professional like Jeremy on, available to you, is you can bring somebody in that can tailor what is needed to your specific situation, your current, you understand what the latest threats are, and you can adapt whatever it is to whatever they need. And so when you're making those investment decisions. How much is the amount that is the right to spend on this particular thing along with the other things that you have? So just bringing somebody in of your caliber can really help out on multiple fronts.
I appreciate that, JT. You said something I want to kind of echo as well. So we help several small companies out there, even some medium-sized companies. And what we first go in at is with a counterintelligence survey. Let's understand what your posture looks like, and let's develop a specific program designed to protect what matters the most to you. We'll walk through those wickets to build that specific program. And at that point, we can hand it over to a company, or one of the other things we offer is kind of a fractionalized program. We'll help manage that for you and maintain good comms and good briefings and good meetings with that particular company. We find both have been really effective in helping our client base out there.
Yeah, that's great. Now, I know if you guys watching this live or watching the replay, you're probably thinking, man, this is too much work. And if you are, you'd be absolutely right. That's why you don't want to try to do this yourself. You want to bring in somebody that has the background, the experience to help you implement a counterintelligence program and even run it for a while until you get up to speed. You know, if I have an electrical problem in my house, I'm not going to tear the walls out and look for the problem. Why? Because I'm going to kill myself. I'm not an electrician. I'm going to bring in a professional. Same thing with this. Bring in the professionals. If you want to connect with Jeremy, let me pull up your. There we go. You can get to him and his team on the website. There's the website. You can click or scan the QR code and make contact with Jeremy. Also, you can reach him on LinkedIn. Just go out there and connect with him. If you want to connect with me or JT, here's my website, QR code. We'd love to talk to you about how to crisis-proof your organization, build strong leadership teams. And with that said, we do have an upcoming workshop that is going to be on, let me see, what's the date? September 16th. All right. This is a 3-hour virtual interactive workshop where we're going to go in detail on how to crisis proof your organization. You'll leave with a journey map on how to do that. We're going to begin with assessing your organization from your standpoint. Where do you think you sit? But we'd love to have you. Seats are limited, so please feel free to scan the QR code and sign up. So before we leave, Jeremy, if you were talking to every corporate leader right now, what is one thing you'd tell them that they need to know in order to crisis-proof their organization through counterintelligence?
You need a program. If you don't have one, now is the time. Do not be one of those organizations that are responding or reacting to an incident. By then, you've already lost something. Proactive is much greater than reactive. Love to help you develop something.
All right. Thanks, Jeremy. All right. We'll see you next week. Crisis Proofing Your Organization, where we'll be talking about hiring the right team. So we'll have a great guest to dive deep into that.